Hi, everyone. Welcome to our latest Irish in the American Civil War campfire chat. You know me and Brendan from Irish in the American Civil War, but today's guest is Danny Levy, who is based in Manhattan but comes out of Offaly and has been doing some fantastic work on Irish American soldiers from County Offaly and with Offaly links. And so we're going to chat for the next while about Offaly in the war and what Danny is doing in relation to that. But I just, for our American viewers, want to give a very, very short idea of Offaly and where Offaly is. It's located in the Irish Midlands in the province of Leinster. And if you're ever researching people from the 19th century, you normally actually won't see Offaly written down because it was called in the 19th century King's County, actually named after King Philip of Spain in the 16th century when the English originally shired it. But it reverted back, if you like, to its Irish name, which was Offaly after Irish independence. Just a bit about immigration numbers in terms of it. If you like, the kind of raw material that Danny's working with are tens of thousands of immigrants out of Offaly. But we do know that at almost 21,000 people from Offaly alone left just in the 1850s to go to the United States. So you're dealing with huge numbers.
Yeah, Danny, excuse me. We were wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your story and how you came to be in New York from Ireland.
Yeah, so I grew up in a village called Road in County Offaly. So if you look at the map of Offaly, it's the top right-hand corner of County Offaly. It's close to the Kildare border, the Meath border, the Westmeath border. And in 1993, which I can't believe is 31 years ago, I came out here with my then girlfriend, who is now my wife. Early in the 90s, this was, of course, pre-Celtic Tiger. He or she wasn't born yet. And visas at the time were relatively easy. There was the Donnelly visa, the Morrison visa for Irish who wanted to travel. So we were in our early 20s and we came over here in 1993. We lived in the Bronx for about a year and then we moved to Yonkers, only a couple of miles different from where we were in the Bronx. And we lived in Yonkers for almost 20 years. About 11 years ago, we moved down to Manhattan. So I worked in the Carpenters Union for many years here in the city. And then about 11 years ago, I changed and I'm now managing an apartment building in Manhattan. So I moved into the city. We moved into the city with our two children at the time, the early 90s, because a huge amount of Irish were coming across all around my age, you know. And I was involved in the GA scene. I played football here. So it was the whole Gaelic Park thing in New York. And so it was a great time. You know, the World Cup was here in 94. There was a huge buzz. And, you know, it was a great time to be young and Irish in New York.
And I understand you're a board member in the American Irish Historical Society. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it kind of happened, I suppose, a little bit by accident. I gave an online talk for Elizabeth Stack, who at the time was with, I think you might know her, Damien. She was with the Irish Heritage Museum in Oslo. She's our executive director now here in New York. She got involved in the interim board. So the society here in New York was closed for a number of years, probably 4 or 5 years. And the previous board tried to sell the building and relocate. And so I had a connection with Elizabeth. I was helping her out in the background for probably 6 or 7 months while she was involved in the interim board. And eventually, I joined the main board, which is almost 12 months ago now. The American Irish Historical Society is about a 10-minute walk from where I'm sitting here on Fifth Avenue. So it's close by, lots of events going on. We just opened up, Elizabeth recently opened up tours a couple of weeks back, so you can tour it. And it's going from strength to strength, a lot of work to do. The archives, there's a huge collection there that never were digitized or catalogued. Well, the catalogue within the building, yes, but so there's a lot of work to do, but it's on the right path, thankfully.
So you've had that long-standing interest in the history of the Irish coming into the States. So tell us a little bit about how that kind of developed into looking at the American Civil War and specifically Offaly guys.
Yeah, it really, I think I told you, Damien, I didn't sit down one day and say this would be a great idea to look into the Offaly American Civil War. as you know yourself, when you're researching one thing, you kind of go down a rabbit hole in something else. And that was the case with me because I was researching a man who had strong connections to Offaly, Cornelius Heaney, who came out here in the 1784. He was very involved with the first Catholic church that was built here in the city. He founded an organization called the Brooklyn Benevolent Society, which is still in existence. It's a non-for-profit society, typically mostly hinging around the Catholic churches and schools. He became very wealthy. He was one of the top funders for the first Catholic church in New York, St. Peter's. So the Brooklyn Benevolent Society gave me access to his archive collection, which is about 6,000 documents, which I still have in my possession. And within those documents, there was lots of information on families from Edenderry that Heaney would have brought to America over the course of 4 or 5 years. Not necessarily blood relatives, but friends or people from the locality. And one of those families was the Bennett family. And that led me to Colonel Michael Bennett. He was with the 28th Regiment. He was one of the first, at the outbreak of the war, when the defensive Washington forts were built on the Virginia side there with Corcoran and them.
Yeah.
Bennett Fort was named after him. So that kind of sparked my interest in the local. Edenderry is about 6 or 7 miles from me. In the local people who, and then I sort of started down the path, which is about 18 months ago now. Yeah. the path or the rabbit hole, whatever you want to call it. And I started searching first on obituaries, which is kind of a morbid way to research, in the newspaper archives with the search term that you mentioned at the beginning, Kings County, Ireland, which was the original name of Offaly. And then just one thing led to another. And a good friend of mine back in Edenderry came on board with me. He's been a big help, Kevin Ging, in researching and helping out. So that's kind of where it started, and that's what led me down onto this path. Our list now is at 520. We're trying now to not keep searching for. We're trying to clean up the list we have,
Yeah.
and make it public. Yeah, within the next few months. We know of the 520. We have the exact location in Offaly where about half of them are from. So we'd like to think that when we make it public, some of those locations will be filled in, and people will say, oh, that. And we also, the idea is to basically fill in the gaps and generate some awareness of the Irish involvement in the American Civil War. I think on this side, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Damien. I think on this side, it's respected is probably the word. It's viewed, the Irish involvement in the American Civil War is understood a lot more in America, I think, than it is in Ireland.
It's complete worlds apart. Yeah. There isn't a good awareness in Ireland at all of the scale.
No.
That's why work like what you're doing is so vital, I think, because, I've always held a long-standing view that, like, even if you say people are from Ireland, people have much more of a connection. They know, oh, well, they're actually from Offaly, where I'm from, or they're from Edenderry in Offaly, which is down the road from me. In an Irish context, this memory, I think it makes it a lot stronger. Yeah. So, it's really impressive you've got so many guys located within the county. That's very impressive.
Yeah. Ancestry.com was a big one. The military sites as well, the newspapers. But I can tell from, what we're doing, like we have about, I don't know, Tullamore is probably the biggest town in Offaly, and I think we've 25 or 30 from Tullamore. But when I tell people from Tullamore, now people that would have interest in history, when I mention to them, I have 25 or 30 people from this town that fought in the American Civil War, they're like, what?
Yeah.
So it just kind of makes you realize that it's virtually, I won't say virtually unknown, somewhat unknown, the involvement. And even my small village, we have 4 or 5 from road, and we have, I don't know, Edenderry, probably 20 from Edenderry as well, And telling people in Edenderry who have an interest in history and all these towns and villages around Offaly, telling them about these people, everyone seems to be
Now, if people have information on more people from Offaly to contribute, is sending it to your email? Is that the best way to share that?
I can be contacted on Twitter at LevyDanny2. Sorry, Danny Levy2 at Danny Levy2, and I can share my email. I gave an online talk. I wrote a few blogs for the Offaly Historical Society back home and shared my email address, and I got some info. But anyone that wants to share anything can reach out to me on Twitter, and I'll send them my email address. Yeah. So we did get a lot of information from a few people that contacted me by email. You know, in Ireland, and this is kind of the hope that when the list becomes public, there could be families at home, not just all over Ireland, that would know that, hear the story about their great grandfather who fought in the American Civil War, and they would know the name and they would know the part of Offaly they came from. So my hope is that a lot of the gaps in our list will be filled in when it's made public.
Because we are talking about, and I beat this drum consistently, like for a lot of the counties, it's the biggest war in history for the numbers of men who served in terms of sheer scale, and people just don't realize that at all. Like,
does it top World War I for Irish involvement?
It's probably it's very close. I mean, we would never know for sure, I think, but for what we could say, I think with a degree of certitude is that for the counties that had the biggest outward migration in the kind of famine era, there would be no comparison. It would far exceed the First World War. There's lots of other factors. Of course, the population's a lot smaller in the First World War, so the First World War is a larger scale based on the population that's within Ireland. But they're terrifically close. And I think there's a huge disparity in awareness now between, I mean, there's been a lot of good work done on the First World War memory over the last 15, 20 years. But between people's knowledge of kind of the First World War and say the contributions of things like the Leinster Regiment, say, versus the American Civil War. But you're not just, Danny, you're not just collecting the names. One of the other things, and I recommend people do follow your Twitter account, because one of the other things you're doing is you're actually visiting the graves of a lot of these men, aren't you?
I am. I'm in New York here, and I visited, I don't know how many, probably 50 or 60 graves in 4 states, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. Yeah, I only yesterday I was in Calvary Cemetery in Queens, and I visited 3 graves of Offaly men who took part in the Civil War. So yeah, my wife, my family don't like these detours to graveyards all across the northeast of America. But yeah, I visited lots of graves, and I put the Offaly flag on, and I take the pictures and I put them up, and got great response to that.
Yeah,
and
fantastic.
Another part of this, which I didn't realize at the start, I made great connections with descendants of a lot of these people through ancestry, and shared the pictures of the graves that I visited that they made. Some of these descendants are in Florida or the West Coast, and they may not have seen pictures of these graves, and they have provided me with lots of information too. As you know, Damien, recently I got a letter from Patrick Brown wrote a letter during the battle in Georgia to his sister about his brother Daniel being captured. There's another Daniel Behan, who was a Confederate soldier. We have about 18 or 19 Confederate soldiers on the list. I made connection with Daniel Behan's descendants of him. They sent me photographs of the accordion that he played and a letter that his dad wrote to him. And even Michael Bennett that I mentioned at the start there, his family have been great to me. The Robertson family here in New York. They got his headstone inscribed there a few months back out in Holy Cross in Brooklyn. So I've been very lucky with the people that I got in touch with.
But Danny, like if you were to, like, what some examples of some of the type of stories and the men that you've been coming across?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, every story is interesting. Any of them that were involved in the Civil War, and we spoke about it, Damien. I think 80 or 90% of the people on my list were famine immigrants. Children of the famine. I say. Children of the famine that became men on the battlefield, or for some of them, they were still children on the battlefield, 15 or 16 years of age. But for me, I think I'm interested in all stories. A couple of Confederate ones were very interesting to me because I always try to track how they got to that location. You know, in the northern states, in the Union states, you could trace immigration. The pockets of immigration usually are around work. It's mines, it's railroads, it's canals or something. You know, so I was always interested in how people from Offaly or even Ireland ended up in southern states pre Civil War. But the family stories are very interesting to me. Sets of brothers, and we have on the list approximately 30 sets of brothers.
Wow.
That could be 2 brothers, 3 brothers, and in one case, the Dunn brothers from Sheercairn, which is just outside Burr. They were in the Wisconsin infantry, all 4 brothers, and they all survived. But their story was very interesting to me, that many of the same family were involved. The Behan brothers that I mentioned a little earlier, that name was Behan in Edenderry, Behan, and it became Bean, Bean in America. I don't know.
Okay.
You know that a lot of these surnames had a lot of changes.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one because it makes it sound very un-Irish, doesn't it?
Yes, yes.
You'd miss that.
And most of the changes, as you know, that the Irish names when they came to America, you can still sort of say that they're Irish.
Yeah.
This was an unusual one. The 2 Behan brothers from Edenderry were Confederate soldiers. One was in South Carolina, and one was in Georgia. Both of them actually survived the war, and like I mentioned earlier, I made a connection with their descendants who gave us a lot of information. John Stevens was from Lusma. He was another Confederate soldier in Georgia. His story is very interesting because his granddaughter, John Stevens, left Ireland around 1850. He followed 2 brothers who had gone to Georgia. He was only about 15 or 16 when he left. He went back to school in America, opened up a business, became very successful, joined the infantry in Atlanta when the war broke out, but survived the war. But his granddaughter, Margaret Mitchell, you probably never heard of her, but she wrote a very famous book called Gone with the Wind.
I didn't realize actually she had a direct connection like that. That's incredible. Yeah.
There's a little bit of Offaly wrapped up in that story.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. Yeah. That's amazing.
I reckon that John Stevens' wife, Anne Fitzgerald, is believed to be the inspiration for Scarlett O'Hara. So that story, that to me was very interesting. But I think of all of them, I could talk for hours about stories. I think the most interesting one for me is the Terrell family from Clara. That's the James, his wife Bridget, their son James, Martin, and son Thomas. So 3 sons and the mother and father were all enlisted in the Union Army in Ohio. And their great-great-grandson, I could be missing one of the greats, is the American actor Ed O'Neill. He's a descendant of the Terrells from Clara.
Right.
And I'm just going to read her obituary, Bridget Terrell's obituary in 1897. States that during the late war, Mrs. Terrell had 3 sons and 15 nephews in the Northern Army and made several trips to the southern battlefields to administer to their wants. Many a dying soldier blessed her for her kindness and care with their last breath. I think Bridget Terrell, of the 520 on our list, is the only woman.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that we find more in the future, but that story for me was very unique, you know.
That's brilliant because you often hear of women nurses and stuff, and Irish women nurses, but they're so rarely named. Never mind being able to know exactly where they come from. That's an amazing story.
Now her maiden name was Lally, and her nephew, I visited a grave in Gettysburg last October. I was there for a few days, and I visited the grave of a Thomas Lally that I knew was from Offaly. He died at Gettysburg, but as it turns out, he's a nephew of Bridget Terrell's.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know what part of Offaly he was from when I visited his grave. I visited 3 Offaly graves at Gettysburg, I think. Maybe 4, I can't remember now. But like I said, to me, the family involvement, sets of brothers, and even and there's a number of incidents on the list where a father and his son are serving in the war. Flynns, two Flynns. I visited. The father actually was killed in Gettysburg, but the son is buried here in Calvary Cemetery. I visited his grave. But there's a lot of incidents of father, son, and father, and maybe two sons or three sons.
It's interesting, Danny, because what it shows as well, like, I mean, I'd argue the two kind of big motivators are, economics is often a big one, but like what you're getting there when you're seeing such an extensive number of certain, like the Tyrrell family there, for example, like that's a commitment to it.
Yes.
Like all those people aren't enlisted unless they really think, we're going here to fight for the United States, save this country. That there's a real ideological commitment there for a lot of these people as well. And I was mentioning at the start that we've come across a few different ones. Brendan, you have a guy from, I mean, the 25th New York. You have a personal connection with, if you like, as well. But and you're researching into it. But you want to mention your Offaly guy?
Sure. So I've done a lot of research on the 25th New York, specifically nicknamed Kerrigan's Rangers, which wasn't specifically an Irish American regiment, but recruited in New York City. They had a lot of Irish in them. And interestingly, a lot of what you said really resonated with what I found about this guy. His name was, on paper, it was John Cahoe, or Coe, spelled Cahoe or Coe, but the records show that his surname in Ireland would have been Keogh. And they had to even have testimony in the pension record saying, this is how it was spelled in the States. This is how they bore the family name as a matter of convenience for them, because I think it just didn't translate well. It was too hard to try to express. Yeah. And also, I'm not sure, I don't believe that his parents were literate too, so they couldn't just spell it out for people, which added to the difficulty. But he was from Edenderry, which you both mentioned. His parents were born, and they had an affidavit from the parish priest there, Reverend Andrew McMahon, from the parish church of, is it Killaan or Killeen?
Killaan, yes.
Edenderry.
Yes, that's where the original church was, in Edenderry, yeah. And
he gave a handwritten transcription of the parish register showing that John's parents, Lawrence Keogh, married Susan or Susanna Duffy, November 18th, 1827. And a lot of times these records outlive the actual parish archives, but I went through the NOI records, and sure enough, that marriage record is there. Well, at least the father would have immigrated pre-famine. He died of cholera in Albany, New York in 1834. I'm not sure when John and his mother emigrated, but they were in Newport, Rhode Island by the time of the 1850 census, where he worked as a tallow chandler making candles, and then as a soap manufacturer. And in that, his mother's pension records, there's testimony that he was supporting his widowed mother, paying most of his wages to her, providing her groceries and all of that.
Wow.
I don't know what brought him to New York, or if he even just came to enlist, because his mother was still in Newport, Rhode Island, but he enlisted in the 25th New York and was tragically killed at the Battle of Hanover Courthouse in 1862. His regiment suffered about 45% casualties there. And a soldier in another regiment in their brigade described them as being composed of New York roughs, Bowery boys, and dead rabbits. And a lot of the officers from this regiment were characters straight out of Gangs of New York. And their colonel, James Kerrigan, was even one of the suspects brought up in the murder of Bill the Butcher. When you get into the records about a lot of the individual soldiers, you find, working class men supporting widowed mothers, supporting wives and kids and all that as well.
It sounds like that was the regiment they ended up in when they weren't wanted in any other one.
Right, absolutely. And I did find, it does seem that way, especially I found some testimony of some soldiers who were younger soldiers who were getting rejected from other regiments, and 25th New York took them in. There was a guy who wandered over from Ohio, even, who ran away from home
I wanted to just touch on one of the guys we have from the Andersonville Irish Project that we're running to try and identify Irish who died at Andersonville. But it's appropriate today because we're having this conversation, as I was mentioning earlier, on the 3rd of July, 2024. So it's the 161st anniversary of Pickett's charge, if you like, the last day of Gettysburg. But one of the regiments that were there were the 125th New York, which were mainly guys out of Troy, New York. Most of them have been, and they've been really heavily engaged in the earlier fighting at Gettysburg, but they were at the Stone Wall on the 3rd of July. And they were a regiment that had they were part of what were called the Harper's Ferry Cowards, because they were part of the group of the garrison in Harper's Ferry that were captured by Stonewall Jackson before the Battle of Antietam, through no fault of their own. But all of those men got labelled the Harper's Ferry Cowards, and they kind of had to try and prove themselves in battle afterwards. And the 125th, but one of the guys there was a guy called John Egan. He was in Company D, and Company D were out on the skirmish line. They were out in front of the stone wall on the 3rd as the Confederates started to launch the attack. And he was from Furban in Offaly, and he had worked. I'm definitely this is the problem I have now with trying to pronounce New York names. Cohoes. He was a factory worker at the Ogden Cotton Mills. So a lot of those places, of course, got severely damaged by the secession, because the cotton that they were relying on was in the South. So a lot of Irish guys thrown out of work. But he was 20 years old at Gettysburg. And one of the guys who was serving with him remembered that a guy called Michael Larkin, who was also Irish, remembered that the whole of Company D were on the skirmish line and were driven back. But John Egan, instead of falling back with the others, remained to fire his musket, and during the delay was captured. And Michael Larkin's, again, this shows the connections. And like a lot of these guys probably are Offaly people too, but certainly Irish. Michael Larkins was the guy, he knew exactly how much money he sent to his mother and everything, because he wrote his letters for him. Because we know that, and so we know John Egan was illiterate. He couldn't write himself. So he had another Irish guy in his unit. But John spent from July the 3rd, 1864, all through the next 12 months in Confederate prisons. He was sent down to Belle Island in Richmond, and then on to Andersonville the following February. But when he died there, he died on the 1st of July, 1864, so a year to the day that the Battle of Gettysburg started, of chronic diarrhea and scurvy. But in the pension application, all the people who give the accounts on his behalf, on his family's behalf, are all other Irish American prisoners, guys who served with him in the regiment, or guys who knew him from Cohoes, where he was serving. So there's a guy, John Tierney, who was captured in November of 1863. He was in the 5th New York Cavalry. He says he met Egan when they were both prisoners. They arrived in Andersonville together on the 17th of February. They spent all their time there together as constant companions. He helped him when he was ill. He says he saw his dead body. So another Irish American, John Mullen, who served with him in 125th New York, was captured at Bristow Station in October, but teamed up again with the guy he knew, the Irish guy he knew in Andersonville. He says he remembered in late June 1864 that he with 3 others carried Egan out of the prison camp to the hospital just outside. He'd been sick at that stage for about a month, and he never saw him again, but everybody knew that he wasn't going to live. And Michael Larkins, who I mentioned about the skirmish line, then given the information. So again, you're seeing all those type of connections that are kind of big to narrow all the time. So just, and a lot of these, even though you can't always show it, a lot of these connections are connections because a lot of these people are probably Offaly people and chain migrants and things like that. What you were kind of harking back to, Danny, what you were talking about, how you first kind of came into the American Civil War stuff with all that kind of chain migration and everything.
Yes, yeah.
What's the hopes for the future, Danny? You kind of touched on it before, but the kind of the next steps.
We want to make the list public, and we're on cleanup duty now for the next few months and make the list public. Hopefully through your website. We will try to fill in the gaps and continue searching for others, I don't know. It's hard to tell how many people from Offaly served in the Civil War. Statistically, if you broke it down, it hinges on how many of famine immigration, really from different counties. If you did the math On the 200,000, it's roughly 6,000 per county, but it doesn't work out that way, as you know. Whatever counties immigration was more prominent during the famine, but I would imagine there's probably a couple of thousand at least, And the reality is, we probably will never know and never find them all. But the law was, I think it's always something that'll be running in the background. There'll never be an end to it. You keep going and you just put up your list and you'll add to it and try and fill in the gaps. That's the goal for it. And on another level that you and I talked about, it would be great to see some sort of memorial in Ireland, or some sort of to all these men and women who fought in the American Civil War on a larger scale.
Yeah.
And the view of the American Civil War to change, I suppose, in Ireland, to make people realise what they did, and the connection between the famine and the Civil War and what all of these people went through. When I went to Gettysburg, I was really shocked that, when you think of the American Civil War and the Irish, you think of 69th in New York, or one or two infantries in Boston or Philadelphia. But the amount of monuments in Gettysburg with a shamrock on it,
it's just incredible.
I couldn't believe it.
It's unbelievable. Even the last few days.
I thought I'd be spending hours looking for certain monuments in certain locations, but it's just one after the other.
It's incredible. We'll leave it there for this, but thanks so much, Danny, for joining us on this, and we'll share all of the details of where people can read about and follow you and everything when we're posting this up, and hopefully there'll be more news soon on Irish and American Civil War about the work that you've been doing. But thanks Danny, and thanks everybody for joining us.